Welcome to Phenomenosophy Season 2, Episode 1. With me is Mr. Gingy. How are you doing today, Mr. Gingy?
Yo, doing pretty good. How are you?
I am very well. So what do you have for us today? What will we be discussing?
Man, so I just recently watched on Instagram, I was getting a lot of people talking about a new movie called Uncle Tom 2. And I realized that that's the second of a two-part documentary. And so I went back to watch episode one. I guess it's not episode, documentary number one. And man, it opened up a lot of stuff for me. And then I went on to watch number two. But in this call, I figured it would be great for us to talk about the Uncle Tom number one. It's basically about African American history, talking about slavery, talking about Jim Crow laws, talking about Republicans and Democrats and which parties have done what for African Americans, and it does get into worldview, like being a victim and racism and systemic racism and things like that. So it's actually quite comprehensive of a film. It's amazing, but it opened up a lot of stuff for me around history, like historic events I had never heard of. So I'd love to get your opinion on some things, and I made a huge bullet point list of basically all of the interesting things that I found all the way through the movie. I think I've got, I don't know, I've got to have 30 bullet points here or something like that.
Okay, sounds good. I think at one point I may have seen part one. I'm not certain, but I will leave it to you to inform me of the content.
Sweet. Yeah, I think it came out in 2020. I don't know when exactly it came out. I'm guessing maybe earlier in the year or somewhere around the summer. So it is probably about 3 years old at this point. But let's dive into it.
Okay, let's dive in.
At the very beginning, they kind of go over a definition of Uncle Tom. And I'd heard this term, but I didn't really understand the connotations behind it. Like what people are implying about you when they call you an Uncle Tom. No one's ever directly called me an Uncle Tom, so I was curious to see what they said. And it's kind of a derogatory term, geared around calling somebody, basically telling them, you're a black person that doesn't believe that they're oppressed, that you've sold out, you've cozied up with white people, and you're pining after acceptance in white culture, white community, and you've basically been brainwashed by white people. That's what people are trying to say when they use the term Uncle Tom. Have you heard that term before?
Right. Yeah, it comes from a book, right? Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Oh, that's right, it does. I forgot about that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I and my understanding is the same. It's you're a whiteified black person.
Or an Oreo. So that kind of comes along with a few different other words like house Negro, and that's kind of like drawing a distinction between the slaves that were out working the fields and the slaves that were serving masta in the house. And one obviously had his life much better than the other, and so it's kind of like cozying up with the slave owner just to have a better life, and turning your back on your own people and not caring about how much they're suffering. But it's interesting because that term has been thrown around a lot. They talked about, I forget the name of the dude who did this film. Let me look it up real quick. And he had been called Uncle Tom. He and Candace Owens had been called an Uncle Tom. I mean, it's not just exclusive to black men. Anyway, it's pretty interesting because nowadays it's less about trying to be accepted by white people and more about you're a black Republican, which was an interesting dynamic that he talked about, talking about how he was raised and followed. He was basically part of the Democratic Party for a long time and supported them until he had a friend of his, as he was starting his journey in Christianity. He basically said, "Hey man, I'm a Democrat because Jesus says that we need to take care of poor, disadvantaged people. And his friend challenged him and said, are you sure it says that you should, or does it say that the government should? And it totally changed his perspective on taking care of poor, disadvantaged people, because he was expecting the government to take care of. So he was like, "I'll vote Democrat, and they'll come out with all these benefits, and they'll take care of the, the poor people and the low classes." And completely shifted his worldview and started looking into, what the Democratic Party had to offer and what the Republican Party had to offer.
Right. So basically, conservatism versus liberalism, which is interesting right away, because there is this nanny state kind of mentality that is really the backbone of liberalism, where and really the backbone of leftism in general. So even whether you're talking about liberalism in the United States, which takes on the form of the Democrat Party, or whether you're talking about communism, which is the ultimate nanny state where the state takes care of everything, everyone, and no responsibilities, but also no freedoms or property or anything else. We'll just leave it all to the state.
Yeah. So his friend challenged him and said, "Why don't you go take a look at what the Democratic Party offers and take a look at what the Republican platform offers?" And he went and read through them and thought deeply about it for, I think, like a week or two. And he was shocked to realize that he was a Republican. He shared more Republican, or values, I'll say, with the Republican Party than he did with the Democratic Party. Because for him, he had always assumed that the Democrats were the party of the people by the people, and they're the ones that were out there trying to support all people. And when he thought, okay, well, maybe I have more principles in line with the Republican Party, but what have they really done for me throughout history? What are they known for? What big things have they done? And so he went historically back to look at Democrats and Republicans. And he was shocked again to find out that the Democrats were responsible for slavery and voting for it and against the civil rights movement. And they're the ones that started the KKK to coerce black families into voting Democratic. Like, if you were to vote for a Republican candidate, the KKK would show up and lynch your eldest son. They were also the party that pushed the Jim Crow laws and got those accepted, and then it was Republicans that repealed those. It was the Republicans that unanimously voted against voted for and got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which freed the slaves and gave black people citizenship and the right to vote, and so on and so forth. And he was just kind of dumbfounded to find out that Democrats had not really done anything but oppose the freedom of black people throughout history. That's something I'd never even heard of.
Right, which is interesting when you juxtapose it on today, where you literally have people, again, the liberal, the leftists, pushing for segregation again. In universities, like I just heard yesterday, they're having 5 different graduation ceremonies at many of the Ivy League colleges. They have a black graduation, they have an Asian graduation, they have what else did they have? I'm sure some of them have a Native American graduation. And a Latino, Latina, Latinx graduation. So what's funny is that they're basically pushing for segregation. And guess what? No white graduation. That's just the general commencement ceremony. That's where whites get to have their graduation. They don't get a graduation to themselves because, they're the oppressor. So I find it interesting that what really was at the foundation of the Jim Crow laws, which was basically segregation, is now rearing its ugly head again under the guise of leftism. Again.
Yeah, basically anti-racism, which in my mind just kind of seems to be the flip of racism. Like, I've seen a lot of similar things to what you're talking about, except for they're creating quote-unquote safe spaces in universities, dedicated for, say, black people in general. And you go to these places and you don't have to be around any other race, and you can kind of relax and not be around anybody but other black people. And I found that so weird because there's other places like BIPOC safe places, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And I'm like, okay, so everybody but white people is allowed. You like, that's
Yeah.
pretty much what that stands for. And to me, it sounds racist. And I've actually been having a lot of good conversations with people around what they think racism is. It's a completely different definition, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. I think we've done that in some other podcasts. I want to stick with this because I want to get through the whole movie and the points, because once we get towards the end, man, it gets really good. But the big point about him talking about the Democrats and Republicans at the beginning of this, for me anyway, is the fact that I had never heard any of this before. Like, in my mind, until watching this film, I was like, oh yeah, well, the Democrats are the ones that have just been fighting for all the people and blah blah blah, and the Republicans have just been like, we don't want to change. The liberals are fighting for change, and that was just kind of what I had in my mind until, like, I never thought about who started the KKK. I never thought about who's behind Jim Crow laws. I never thought about the civil rights movement and what the motivations were behind that. Like, I would have actually guessed, oh, it was all Democrats. There's the Democrats behind all of that. They're the ones that had the war on crime and the war on poverty and the war on drugs and the war on whatever.
I'm curious, does he ever address the fiction of the, what do they call it, the big switch or something?
He does, yeah. That comes a little bit later in the film, but we
awesome.
can talk about it now.
Okay. No. I just wanted to make sure that he goes over, because I think that's key in this conversation, because that is when you start to bring up the actual historical facts of Democrat, or I'll say liberals versus conservatives in race relations and in racial progress, that the big claim by the liberals is that at some point everyone switched places. Basically, all the liberals became conservative, and all the conservatives became liberals, and all the liberals became not racist, and all the conservatives just all of a sudden became racist. So I think it's a funny trope, I guess, at this point. But I just wanted to make sure that he addresses it and goes over it. So I think that's key to this conversation. Otherwise, you leave that opening.
Yeah, and we can talk about it now because it's just a quick little blip that did come up. All they really said was that the two parties had switched, but really they didn't, and they couldn't find any real evidence that the parties did switch. They go back and look at John F. Kennedy or something like that, and he was a gun-tooting, American-loving, Democrat, but under current left values and right values, he would be considered a Republican right now. And so it is kind of weird.
He'd be considered a far right extremist.
Yeah, absolutely. The only other comment that they threw on that was like, the parties didn't really switch, just they just moved slavery to what they call a welfare state. They said welfare state is slavery 2.0. Anyway, so after that, they started getting into, historic events and characters like Margaret Sanger, which we'll get into a little bit later, the KKK and Jim Crow South, and, we talked about a little bit already. But they also got slightly into Booker T. Washington and his Tuskegee, I forget what it was, a school of some kind that he had set up, and the Black Wall Street in Oklahoma. And just basically, those were just sort of minimally summarized as huge of events as they were and huge characters as they were, kind of summarized in what was going on post-slavery and pre-civil rights. Because that's kind of like the lost era of African-American culture. Like, how much have you heard about what happened after people were freed and before, like, Martin Luther King?
Very little. I know that they'll point to Reconstruction, actually not in mainstream. I would say really all I've got is from like history class, and I remember conversations around Reconstruction, which is when you had again the Democratic South and Southern states, really kind of putting in the foundation of segregationism, right, and suppression of black voting or manipulation of blacks and what. And I think you've already kind of gone over some of that. And I've heard summaries of in like history class where it's like just kind of breezed over of like, here's here's what happened during Reconstruction kind of thing, and not a whole lot of detail. And then really that's it. And I mean, Reconstruction is really what maybe accounts for a decade or two after the Civil War. And then you have, almost 60, 70 years that are just kind of missing. As far
Do you remember
as
what year's Reconstruction was?
I don't, I would say beginning in 1865. I don't know when they consider it officially ended, um, but I would say at least a decade, maybe two. So 1865 to maybe 1885. But I'm not a historian. Don't quote me on that.
You're pretty close. I just Googled it, and it says Reconstruction in the U.S. history was the period from 1865 to 1877.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah,
12
pretty
years.
close.
Yeah. um, I mean, it's interesting because they started touching on a lot of points that they really went into depth later. So I'm kind of trying to decide whether or not I want to introduce some spoilers or not. But they talked about the introduction of ideas, like the idea that black people are handicapped in some way because of their race, that they're victims of some type of system. If you're looking at like the boom that the African American communities had for the first 5 to 10 years after slavery, it was like within a half of a century or something like that, you had 50-60% of them becoming fully literate. You had these people starting all these businesses. You had millionaire black people being created, and just amazing stuff, which they talk about it a little bit in depth later. And actually the discovery that most people weren't really that racist or bigoted anyway. It was very much so the minority of people that they got. Like, one guy was telling a story about how when he was at Boy Scouts camp, he was out there in California with a bunch of Boy Scouts, and it was like a handful of black guys and say a couple hundred of white guys, and they were all out there Boy Scouts. And one guy got into a fight with him and called him the N-word, and he had to hold back all the other white kids in there from beating the crap out of this kid. Like, they were more pissed off about it than he was.
Right.
And he really realized, he's like, wow, man, like, it's pretty much everybody against the bigots. Like, it's not just black people against white people.
Right. And that actually, I think that says something about the culture in general. So right now I'm not just speaking about black culture in the United States at that time, but also culture in general in the United States. Remember, we have at the foundation of the principles of the founding of this country were the Judeo-Christian principles. And in reality, remember, slavery was this worldwide phenomenon. It was not limited to the Americas. Almost every culture since the beginning of civilization, human civilization, has practiced slavery in in one form or another. But it was the Christian ideals, specifically the Quakers, and I want to say they really started pushing back against slavery in either the 1600s or the 1700s. So really, the abolitionist movement kind of grew out of the Judeo-Christian principles of the Quakers specifically. And as the Quakers kind of brought this to the foreground, like, hey, we're all children of God and we should be treating each other as children of, therefore we shouldn't be enslaving each other. Which is interesting because if you look at the Bible itself, it doesn't really say anything against race or not racism, but against slavery, because it was just a part of culture. It was just a given that slavery was part of human civilization since its beginning. So there was no really there wasn't passages to the Bible that demonized it or made it wrong. It was just like an accepted aspect of our culture or of civilization in general. And then with the Enlightenment, beginning in what I guess it would be about the 1500s or so, You have people starting to apply their Judeo-Christian principles as opposed to just taking the Bible for what it says literally, because people could point to the Bible and say, "Well, it talks about slavery and doesn't say it's wrong." The Quakers kind of took a different interpretation. We're like, "No, we're all human beings, and therefore we should all be treating each other the same way. We're all children of God." So that's those Judeo-Christian principles are probably why the experience of even racism and bigotry was limited, because the culture in the time period that you're referring to was still very much steeped in Judeo-Christian principles. Now today, we don't really have that. I mean, there are still people who call themselves Christians and people who still live their lives by Judeo-Christian principles, but it is not the majority. Um, so I think that may play a role in that, and why there was this acceptance of people in general, regardless of the race, because that's, if you look at from the time the Quakers started speaking out against it, the abolitionist movement just grew and grew and grew. In fact, it was, and when I say Quakers, I'm not talking about the Quakers of the United States. These were the Quakers in England before they even really had a large foothold in the United States. And that's why England was at the forefront of outlawing slavery worldwide, was because of, again, these Judeo-Christian principles.
If you think about just this country's history specifically, um, we enshrined that right into constitutions and the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, all of it. Um, that's part of what I remember learning from Martin Luther King, was that he was talking about aligning the people, the American people, to the American principles, and that's something I really thought was amazing, and wanted to get behind an idea like that. It's interesting. Like, another thing that I hadn't really realized, but then in hindsight, it makes perfect sense. Like, it's what my experience has been, is that the Judeo-Christian, beliefs and principles and practices, they are an intimate aspect of African American history, even though it's not necessarily a natural African, religion. It's something that they learned from Western culture while they were in the U.S. I think. I mean, this is again stuff that I've learned probably through public education. So I would assume that it's that way, but even regardless if it was or if it wasn't, you take a look at what had them so successful from the late 1800s to the mid 1900s, and they posted some pretty interesting statistics. They said that 85% of black families, they had two-parent households, and they weren't rich, but they were well off, like middle class, and they all had they said they called them their institutions, but I took that to mean that everybody went to church, everybody went to Sunday school, everybody was part of a community. People were walking through the streets. Like, they said that grandparents could walk through the streets freely without worrying about being accosted by their grandchildren. It's kind of the way that they put it. Whereas nowadays, you'd look at somebody that's maybe in their 80s or something like that, and their grandkids would be the ones that are out on the streets, robbing and threatening, being violent. It's really interesting, because that was such a massive point, is those Judeo-Christian values that they took on early on, growing up out of whatever situations they found themselves in. Anyway, they compared that to the current state that we are in now, where instead of idolizing your father figure or Jesus or whatever else, you're looking up to guys like Jay-Z and Colin Kaepernick, and this they said victimhood is a hot commodity these days, and the communities are still suffering. Whereas if they were looking up to guys like Booker T. Washington, or there was another guy, I don't remember his name right now, but there were some other big African American figures that their main thing was like, work hard, develop a skill, and then you will be, and place yourself in society, and you will be successful. And guys like Larry Elder and Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, these guys are unheard of iconic figures in African American culture that all were basically Republicans that talked about self-responsibility, self-reliance, small government, basically being responsible and stuff like that.
Right. I love that Larry Elder in his recent uh, try at the governorship of California was literally called the black face of white supremacy by mainstream media in California.
Yep, I saw
Basically,
that.
because of conservatism and Judeo-Christian principles. So it's now conservatism and Judeo-Christian principles that has become part of the definition of quote unquote whiteness in our culture. And this is at least this is my perspective, and this is a tool by which they attempt to radicalize people of color against those aspects of our culture, which in reality, like you just went over, created prosperity for people of color throughout history, is now you've sold them on one, the victim mentality, and two, they now have a new set of martyrs and idols that they look up to. So they're no longer looking up to religious figures or saints as models, and they're looking to, like you said, rappers and athletes and things like that, who
Mm-hmm.
are also upholding these victimhood worldview.
The commodity of being a victim.
Yeah, yeah,
um, it's cool. They went on to talk about how, the idea of I'm oppressed, which I hate using that. I mean, there's one guy in there that talked about what we live in right now is a marketplace of ideas. Everyone's trying to sell you an idea, and in fact, all the arguments, if you go listen to enough of them, you'll hear the common language through each one of them is, the idea of, wham, poor is me. The idea of, I mean, everyone's just talking about ideas. It's no longer the acts or, whatever else you could associate with a person. It's, it's a marketplace of ideas. But in here, they do talk about, if you've got the impression that you are oppressed, if you take that and it's one of your core beliefs, it turns into a self-fulfilling prophecy. All those people that actually are oppressed by these systems are the ones that believe they are. Like, most of the people that they interviewed in this documentary said, I didn't realize I was oppressed until I got to college. And I started arguing with my white professors, and they told me, you'll never make it because you're a black-white female. Black-white, a black female.
I was gonna say you're black, white, female, or even worse, she might even be straight.
Yep, probably, and probably a Christian. However, they did throw this statistic out, which was interesting. They said that the most successful black Americans these days are Nigerian Americans because they didn't get brainwashed by the media. I don't know how true that is, but I was like, well, they just showed a clip of a bunch of them talking and how successful they had been, and they were like leaders in these communities, and they were all Nigerian Americans.
Yeah, actually, that's funny that you say that because there's a really good friend of mine and business partner of my brother, and he's from Nigeria, and he's a doctor and extremely successful. And he was, I'm not sure when he moved to, because he's actually educated in England, so that's where he got his doctorates and things like that. But I know he was born in Nigeria. I don't know at what time he went to England, but it's, culturally speaking, and familiar with his brother. I've never met his brother in person, but you can tell just if you're just in a conversation with them, they're definitely not in the victim mentality, and they are
Mm-hmm.
extraordinarily successful.
I mean that kind of goes into hand in hand. It being that 80 to 90% of the news is estimated to be left leaning, and that's where these ideas are coming from. When in reality, they contrasted that with the fact that if you were to look up the GDP of the black communities across the U.S., they would be they would comprise the 15th wealthiest nation on the planet.
Wait,
like
just Nigerian Americans?
no, sorry, African Americans in general.
Oh, okay.
So count the Nigerians in there with all of the other African countries in America.
Right, right.
I mean, the Nigerians are the ones that just accepted America as an idea and decided to follow it through. You know what I mean? Personal responsibility, self governance, the land of opportunity, you name it. Um, which is interesting. It goes to the next point that they made in the movie where they talked about the schism between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Have you heard of both those guys?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. In fact, that's part of the high school history education. But what's notable is that Booker T. Washington is glossed over for the most part, and W.E.B. Du Bois is kind of promoted and held up, which I find interesting because, again, W.E.B. Du Bois being a socialist, aka communist, and how Booker T. Washington, who was, to my understanding, an advocate of work ethic and not being caught up in the oppressed or victim mentality, um, that they gloss over Booker T. Washington and emphasize the contributions of W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah. I mean, they talk about how Booker T. Washington was born into slavery, and then once he found out he was freed, he walked across the entire state of Virginia to some school and got his education, and then made his way. I want to say down to I almost said Manhattan, but I know it's not that. It's Harlem, and he started his own school. And it might not even been in Harlem, but he created millionaires. Like there was,
I don't think that was him directly. I believe his school was in a southern state. I don't remember which, Alabama, Georgia, something like that.
it was
Yeah, it
in
was
Alabama.
actually, I want to
That's
say
right.
it was one of his students that actually started the move towards Harlem, started buying up buildings in Harlem. And because at that time, Harlem was a white community, predominantly white. And one of Booker T. Washington's students, or a student of his Tuskegee Institute or whatever it was, um, made his way to Harlem and started buying apartment buildings, and then started eventually African Americans started moving into Harlem and basically not only renting spaces from this guy who was buying up buildings, but they started creating businesses. They started buying up their own properties. And before you know it, Harlem became a really, at least again, this is my understanding, a really successful um, example of a black community, or predominantly black eventually, and I think this is like the early 1900s, right? Like just after the turn of the century is when they started this move to Harlem.
Mhm. Well, Booker T. Washington is the guy, along with some other business partners, not just him, started an African American real estate investment company, basically. And those are the guys who started going and buying up a bunch of real estate all over the place, which inevitably turned into Harlem. And as that built, it became one of those, like, they contrasted it with Black Wall Street in Oklahoma, and those were two of like the most wealthiest black owned communities to ever have existed. Now, again, I've just gone through this movie and I've written down a bunch of notes and stuff. I haven't really fact checked all of this, so you may be right. It may have been one of his students that went up to Harlem and really got it off the ground, or maybe he just bought some property there and somebody else was doing it. I'm not totally sure, but the whole story of him was like going from slavery and teaching hundreds or thousands of people to be self-reliant and creating all of this entrepreneurialism and creating massive amount of wealth for these different, black families and groups, and then being called a house Negro and Uncle Tom and being belittled for not believing that slavery was still holding black people down. Like
Wait. Are you saying that this was happening back then, or is this people looking back at history and making those judgments?
What do you mean? Ask that question again.
Okay, so you're saying that they were being, called these derogatory terms, but what I'm asking is, was
Yep.
that from, a later date looking back, or are you talking about like, was this something like W.E.B. Du Bois was doing? Because I know W.E.B. Du Bois as a socialist was most likely pushing this victimhood mentality, but I can also see that that derogatory view of what was being done in Harlem as a more modern phenomenon of like maybe people in the 60s, 50s, and 60s looking back at that time and making those derogatory comments and judgments.
From the impression that I got was that happened in the age of Booker T. Washington versus Du Bois.
Okay.
Because Booker T. Washington was basically going out there saying like, demonstrate your value, and we'll be accepted into any community because we'll be seen as valuable. And Du Bois was saying, he believed more in a protest-oriented demanding of rights. Basically, he was a socialist who turned communist and then eventually renounced his U.S. citizenship, his American citizenship. Whereas like Booker T. Washington's institute still stands today. They were saying that we have a lot to learn from people like Booker T. Washington because his impact on society still exists. Well, constructively still exists. I'd say that Du Bois' impact still exists as well, but it's not a constructive impact. So I'm sure that he's been demonized both back in the day, 100 years ago, and today. Anyway, and this is the next point that they went into is the thing that I think I talked to you about a couple days ago. I made sure to detail this out a little bit more, but it's one of my favorite stories when people start talking about reparations and racism and how disadvantaged people of color are. There's this guy in the movie called Herman Cain, and they did an interview with him, and he worked for a few different businesses like Pillsbury or something like that, but eventually he quit all of that and he got hired by the Department of the Navy. And for 4 quarters in a row for his first year, he got like the top accolades, top performer, along with this other guy that he was working next to that started around the same time. And then the second year he was
in the
there.
Navy, or was he in the Navy or a contractor for the Navy?
I'm not sure. He just said that he worked for the Department of the Navy.
Okay.
And so the second year that he was working there, same thing, 4 quarters in a row, top worker accolades, and his white counterpart kept getting promotions, pay bumps and stuff, at least like 2 months quicker than he would. So he went to his boss and he asked him, and he was like, why is I'm doing just as good as this guy, why is it that he's getting his bonuses quicker than me? And the guy was like, well, it's because he's got a master's degree. He goes, oh, it's not because he's white? He goes, no. He goes, okay. So he went and got a master's degree. And he came back and he's like, hey man, I've got a master's now. I mean, it didn't happen overnight, right? A master's takes at least a couple of years depending on how much education you've had. And he said, keep me in mind for the next promotion. And it wasn't long after that he got promoted to lead what he called the GS-13. He was the supervisor and head mathematician on a special project called Rocket Assisted Projector, where they were basically doing a bunch of aeronautic stuff. wherein he had 8 white people working for him. And when he left the department, his supervisor called him in for an exit interview and said, you know what, Mr. Kane? He's like, you have taught me something in your time here. And he said, well, what's that? He said, I've never worked with a black person before, and you taught me not to judge somebody by the color of their skin. And I'm like, it gives me chills to even like utter those words and to think about that as a reality for people. I mean, it just goes to show that you can't, like, if they had forced this guy to hire him and he went through and he didn't strive to be the best at what he did, that guy would have been like, well, all these black people, that I've ever worked with operate like this. And he would have left with a certain mentality and belief about judging people by the way that they look. But this guy defied every expectation that he had for him, amazingly. And it just, man, I love stories like that. It brings tears to my eyes. It warms my heart. Probably one of my favorite parts of the movie.
When do you know about what the timeline was? Like what decade that was in?
Let's see. If I had to guess, I would probably say the 80s or something. He looked to be in his like 70s or something. He looked to be retired, but still kind of early retirement maybe. And he lived long enough to work for several different jobs and then go have a career with the Navy and then quit, so he still does consulting, I think, for people here and there, but yeah, I couldn't tell you. I would guess he's in his 70s or something.
Right. It's interesting because it reminds me of the story that Clarence Thomas tells about what do they call that program? Affirmative action. How as soon as they started instituting affirmative action, that he felt cheated because he got what he got through merit. And because they started instituting all these affirmative action programs, the assumption and presumption of many was that he got to where he got because he was black, which again, that's the equity conversation, right? Which is basically neo-Marxism. And it's something that he really wishes didn't exist, because now there's this baked in judgment that I got here because the color of my skin, not because of my competencies or my merit. So I find that interesting that, again, you're in the gentleman you just mentioned, Herman Cain, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of the same thing where he got what he got through merit and through his competency, as opposed to, he didn't get hired because he was black. He didn't get promoted because he got hired and promoted because of his merit and competencies. And his work ethic, I'm sure, played into it as well. That's where you get all the promotions from.
Absolutely. What's really funny is the people that I've talked to in my own personal life, not a single one of them ever would wish to be a diversity hire.
Right. Yeah, nobody actually wants to be one.
Right. Nobody wants to be that or claim that or I mean, imagine being the guy who's suffering his way through life, and someone comes down and gives you this handout and says, we're going to put you in a management position at Apple, and you have no idea about phones or marketing or business or anything. They put you in position there, and you constantly feel like you're not in the right place. And then you go around telling everybody, yeah, I'm the diversity. Like, nobody wants to experience that. Everybody wants to say, I earned this position. I deserve to be here. Like, I'm moving on. I'm getting better. Like, a diversity hire doesn't, climb the corporate ladder and achieve massive levels of success within an organization. They don't become a highly successful entrepreneur. They don't, that's just not how it happens.
Right. Well, because the essence of what makes a person successful and that drives a person up those ladders is their work ethic, their competency, the merit of what they bring to the table. And if you don't have any of that, if you don't have any of that, then there is no moving up the ladder. Now, I'm not going to say that they're not going to necessarily, especially in today's workplace, especially if you look at places where they're, extra woke and extra, what's the word? Focused on diversity, equity, and inclusivity. What you're going to find is just a high level of incompetency throughout the organization. In fact, I think that that's what we're seeing with Hollywood in particular, is that, the quality of what comes out of Hollywood is just spiraling down the drain. And it's probably has a lot to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, that nobody is really being given their positions based on their merit, their talent, their work ethic, or anything else. It's like, oh, we need a couple more black guys. Go get a couple more black guys. Oh, we need a couple more lesbians. Go get a couple more lesbians. And then that's how they're filling roles, as opposed to, well, do you have any experience at this job? Are you good at this job? Let me see some of your work. Let me see some of your references. Like, these are things that people aren't looking at right now. And I'm not saying everywhere. I know in my business, I'm not going to hire based on your color. I'm going to hire based on your competency, based on your work ethic. Like, that's all I'm interested in, because I want my business to be successful. And so I want, regardless of your color, I don't care what your color is. Are you competent? Are you good at what I need you to do? And that's about it. Like, if you meet those requirements, I'm going to hire the person with the highest level of merit. So it's a combination of those things. When I look at work ethic, talent, and merit, it's who scores the highest based on those indicators, right? Based on those metrics. That's what I'm going to base my hiring on, because that's what's going to make my company successful. And this is why I kind of push back on the idea that a lot of business owners and things out there hire people because of their color, right? Like, oh, they hire white people, and there's this white privilege, and they're getting hired because they're white. Dude, anyone who's worth their salt and runs a business is not going to hire someone based on their color. It's just not going to happen, because you're not going to be successful. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I know there's nepotism, right? So I know people get hired because of the family they come from, because of their connections and relationships. I'm not naive. I do realize that there's nepotism out there. However, it's few and far between. If you hire everyone in your organization based on nepotism, based on how they're connected to you, how they know you, or what the color of their skin is, dude, your business is doomed. Good luck. You know what I mean? You're going to fail.
Well,
because you don't have competency.
There's also something to say about building a culture of an organization, because you don't want to, like my perfect example, I've got a buddy who works at a company, and he got the job over somebody else, and he was less qualified, not because he's white, but because he's ex-military and, kind of has the same type of disposition and views on life. And just in the interview, they're like, oh man, I like that guy. We can have some fun here. And the job wasn't particularly, demanding of exclusive skill sets or anything like that. So they had that flexibility. Guaranteed, if he had to perform at a certain level that he couldn't, he probably wouldn't have gotten the job. However, the fact is, he got the job mostly because he fit the culture. And if you don't have a healthy, productive culture in an organization, it can fall apart no matter how good or how diverse the people are in the group.
Right. And actually, I'm going to revise my statement there. I would definitely take that into consideration. Here's who I'm not going to hire. Ivy League graduates, any kind of a social studies major, because of what they would do to the culture. They would be pure poison to the culture, because what they're going to bring in is a sense of victimhood and again, you see this in all these organizations, whether it be Netflix or Amazon or Facebook or Google. they have way too many social justice warriors in their ranks that, if anything, have a negative impact on the culture of the business, right? I remember a story from a couple years ago where a white cisgendered male programmer at Google he could not take the culture anymore, right? Because he was constantly being singled out as an oppressor, and everyone else being given, hand ups because of their oppressed class. And to him, it was just plain out bigotry and racism towards him, and it's a toxic culture. So here, a highly skilled, highly talented individual with programming skills, which is pretty important to the Google infrastructure, is driven away by the culture of Google. And so I would say that is actually a really important aspect, is what is the mindset of the person you're hiring. So beyond merit, beyond competency, yes, definitely a mindset, because the woke ideology is people hold that with like a religious fervor, and if they bring that into your organization, it could be very destructive. In fact, you see it playing out that way in many organizations.
Yeah. I genuinely believe that most of the people who harbor, worldviews, beliefs, positions basically like that, they have good intentions behind them, but the effects are cancerous, poisonous, destructive in some way. And that's what they went over in this movie. They had one guy actually sit down and start talking about the minimum wage laws. And he was like, well, of course that's good. You want to make sure everyone's getting enough money to live and blah. And he's went on this whole thing, and he had a professor in college that said, that's good. The intent is good, but let's look at the effects of it. And they went over the effects of minimum wage laws. They went over the effects of the welfare stuff. I forgot. Oh man, I'm losing my words right now. But they looked at the effects of welfare and the effects of minimum wage laws, and it was crippling to black communities. And you look back on some of these monumental events, and you're like, oh man, it portrayed so well. And you go to school and you start learning about how important this was and how constructive this was for American development and history. And then you actually start looking into the facts behind it, and you're like, well, before this, people were actually much better than after this. And then somebody brought up a quote that I never really thought of, but that I found very, let's just say, I think it's very important, but I haven't continued to, I feel like I need to think about it and think on it and be with it for a little bit. But they basically said, quote unquote, history is not written by the victors. History is written by the academics. And it hit me. Because you come in and you conquer a civilization and you write the laws, but if the people that are going and teaching the next generation aren't writing this or teaching the same things that you wrote, well then history remembers those events very differently. And if it's in academics' hands, then you can really change the academics who are doing the teaching. You can change the materials that the academics are teaching. And eventually you can completely rewrite history generation after generation after generation. In fact, I remember learning one version of Christopher Columbus in elementary school and a totally different version of Christopher Columbus in middle school. Right. And I was like, oh, I guess we're supposed to learn it this way now. And I had to unlearn and relearn. And it sits with me as true right now, but I haven't, again, it's only been a few days. I'm really curious to if that is true. What do you think about that quote of history being written by the academics?
Well, in our culture, definitely. I definitely see that, which now brings back the significance of the Frankfurt School's infiltration of our educational system and neo-marxism's just being so prevalent and widespread throughout academia. It actually makes sense why history has been rewritten the way that it has been rewritten. So again, these the DEI ideas, right? Ideology of wokeness all comes from neo-Marxism. It's just rather than it being dual in the case of the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, it's now basically straight white men versus everyone else. Straight white men are the bourgeoisie, and your oppressed class is pretty much everyone else. So it's a reframing of the same ideas. And because in academia, neo-Marxism has had a foothold for, gosh, at least over 60, 70 years now. So it makes sense why this transition in history has occurred, because not only, and if we say, by academia we mean the university system and the university professors, well, those same university professors, not only are they teaching the people who go out into the world and become engineers and other things like that, but they also teach the next generation of teachers who are teaching in elementary schools and middle schools and high schools. And so their ideas, their ideology is now infecting the youth as well, even though, you know, your kindergartner, your first grader isn't going to some university with some crazy neo-Marxist, teaching him subjects, but the teacher who's in his class has been educated by that crazy neo-Marxist. And so the oppressor-oppressed ideas become a part of the history and the rewriting, right? So it's, and again, goes back to the ideas of Antonio Gramsci and the implementation of of Marxism, or not Marxism, but communism through Mao, or Mao's flavor of Marxism or of communism, where it's about undermining the culture. So you undermine the culture, you rewrite the history, you make martyrs out of the quote unquote oppressed, and you turn your heroes and your founding fathers and the people who actually did the work to build a great nation, you turn them into the villains, right? Which is why you don't hear about Booker T. Washington, right? Because he didn't have the right mentality as far as the neo-Marxists are concerned. His mentality was, work hard, to get what learn a trade, work hard, you will be successful, right? And that doesn't fit with the neo-Marxist ideology. The neo-Marxist ideology, you have to convince everyone that they're victims, and so that they will embrace a system of government that controls all aspects of our lives, so that we can take from one group and give to another group. And none of that is based on a free market. None of that is based on individual liberties. It's something else entirely, which is interesting, because these people have grown up in a culture, in a society where we do have, individual liberties, and we value individualism and independence and things like that. But they've been coaxed into, or they've bought into, because of its attractiveness, the idea of just getting something for nothing, right? I don't believe that the people who really push these ideologies are true believers. I don't believe they really believe in them. I believe that it's just what's really at where the pressure for this ideology comes from is people who just want some form of totalitarianism, and realize that the most attractive form of totalitarianism is Marxism, because you sell the youth on the idea that, oh yeah, you're just going to get something for nothing, and it's very attractive. So I think that's why the youth, even though they've grown up in a culture where they have individual liberties, they have independence and all these things, which they're not realizing that the trade-off that comes with eliminating the free market and giving all that power over to the government. The trade-off is totalitarianism. No more individuality, no more independence. You don't have those things anymore. But it goes along with not having responsibility, which is what the victim mentality really pushes, is you're not responsible, you're not accountable. But if you're not responsible, not accountable, well, then you don't really have any rights, because with rights comes responsibility and accountability. So the victim mentality is really double-edged. It's a double-edged sword in that it not only is there that element of no responsibility, no accountability, but there's also the other edge, which is no rights. The state dictates your position. The state dictates your when and how and where you work, and there is no free market, right? So you don't determine the value of your labor. You don't harness or pursue the trades or professions or things that you want to do. Those things are assigned and given to you. So there's just this huge lack of understanding of where that mentality leads to, and why these educators, these neo-Marxists who are rewriting history, why they're writing it the way that they're writing it.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that these guys return to several times throughout the documentary is how much the liberal side of government, made certain decisions, like how since the civil rights bills passed, created by JFK and then signed into law by Lyndon Johnson. That's LBJ, right? Yeah. Since then, it was almost as if the narrative of the country had shifted, and they were able to kind of stick the marketing of the Democratic Party to the party of the African American people, which in reality, Al Gore's father, Al Gore Sr., this was a funny thing. I had no idea it even happened, but they said he mounted the longest filibuster in the history of the Senate in order to prevent the Civil Rights Bill from getting even to the floor for a vote. And he lived a Democrat and died a Democrat. And I mean, just the contrast between Democrats and Republicans and the history I've heard about and the history I haven't heard about really opened my eyes to a lot of stuff in this documentary that I never would even have considered or be interested in the first place. Like you were talking about with education, people start talking about, I majored in African American studies. I'm like, oh, great, who gives a shit? But that's because everything that I've ever heard from it just gives me more reason to feel bad about myself. Had I actually ever been exposed to hey, here's two different African Americans and they both had conflicting viewpoints, and here's what they created in their lives, and here were the impacts, and this is how these people got helped, and this is how these people got helped, I would be so much more interested in history. I want to know all about the people that built Harlem. I want to know all the people that built there was a bus lines and stuff that were created before Rosa Parks and all this stuff. There were, Black Wall Street in Oklahoma. I want to know how these things were built. I want to know how all of this evolution from the late 1800s all the way up to the 1950s. It's that's a black hole. I know nothing about it. And they even said that from 1930 to not from 1930, but from the 1930s till the 1940s, during the height of segregation and Jim Crow laws, African Americans had the highest marriage rate out of any group in the U.S. Church served as their social and communal anchors, and neighborhood violence was at almost zero. They had thriving and growing businesses. They built hospitals, they built dental schools, they built hotels, movie theaters. No one ever talks about that. And the first thing that I think when I hear that is, okay, is that true? I've never heard anything about that before. I need to go research now from the 1930s to the 1940s and verify this. And then obviously in the film they start talking about people that were alive back then, my father, he was born in 1910 and he was doing X, Y, and Z, and he talked to us about all this stuff, and it's amazing. The legitimacy, the crime rates, the illiteracy, etc., all of those things have gotten worse, they said, since the 1930s.
Well, and it's interesting that you brought up that the Democrats were very much against the Civil Rights Act, but remember, it was a Democrat who signed it into law. So what changed?
Mm-hmm.
What changed? And in reality, well, what came with? Well, that's the question, right? Because we know how government works, how legislation works, and it's you alter and change legislation to get people to vote for it, right? So what came with the Civil Rights Act was
Well, let's talk about it.
LBJ's Great Society. Oh, that's probably what you meant when you said New Deal. Did you mean the Great Society?
No. They said New
Okay.
Deal, and I wrote that down, and I was just trying to run past a bunch of stuff.
Okay. Well, I mean, so there's that element, right? What was the Great Society? You know, and that's where you get the war on poverty and
That's
all
right.
this stuff. So it was almost it's insidious, right? So what effect did the Great Society laws have, or policies, I should say? That's more accurate description. What effect did the Great Society policies have on Black culture?
Well, here's what they said in the movie. They basically boiled it down to a couple of different things, and they were mostly connecting it to what they called generational fatherlessness. And so, previous to the 1962 to 1963, 85% of Black families had a man and a woman raising a child together, biological child together, not like an adopted kid or anything like that. And they said Cloward and Piven, both sociologists at the Columbia University School of Social Work, theorized that if they could separate work from income, it would make men redundant, and if we could remove the stigma of welfare, it would bankrupt cities and counties. And so soon after that, these new ideas started being introduced. Nuclear families became Eurocentric and racist. The women's movement agreed, and the Black Power movement agreed, and millions of Black people flooded into the welfare system in less than 4 years, at a time where unemployment rates were at like an all-time low of less than 4%. And then out of wedlock births went from under 25% up to over 70% in that same time frame. Like,
Wow.
almost like a light switch went off. They said during slavery, a biological child was more likely to be raised by both parents today, or by both parents, than it is likely to today.
A biological child versus a robot?
Or an adopted child or something.
Oh, okay. Well, you said biological child, and I'm sitting here like, okay, what other kind of children are there besides biological ones?
GMOs, bro. GMO child.
Imaginary, I guess, imaginary ones.
Yeah. So basically, as a kid, you had a better chance of being raised by both your parents during slavery than you do today. And
Right.
they talked about all of the biggest problems that the African American communities face today, not way back in the day, but today, can all be stemmed back to fatherlessness. You have a kid being raised without a father, creates a certain type of adult, which, guess what, is more likely to be a present father. We'll say it's a male child growing up to be a man. He's got a less likely chance to be around for his children. So now you've got generational fatherlessness. And they said that like more Black people are killed in 1 year by other Black people than the KKK killed in the entire 70 years they've been in existence. Every year. And 52% of all Black pregnancies ended in abortion. That's 1,786 abortions per day since 1973. That's millions and millions of abortions. I'm not advocating for or against abortion or anything, but if you're just looking at the statistics, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, and again, that would have been. Now, again, I don't know if it, like, in the current state of things. Okay, let me back up. My question: if we look at Black culture in the United States in, let's say, the 1950s, where you did have fathers in the home, you had a much higher level of prosperity, you had entire successful black communities. What happened? Why would you trade all that in? Why let it all go? Like, my question is, what happened to Harlem in that transition? What happened to Tulsa in that transition? Why all of a sudden did it just all get let go of? Like, and I'm guessing this has something to do with ideology, that there was this mindset, right? That there was this mindset that people were being infected with that affected that. Because why would you give all that up? Why would you let all that go? What convinced the black communities in America to let go of what they had, the prosperity that they had, the success that they had, the families that they had?
Greener pastures. Like, that's the only thing that makes sense to me. They got enrolled into some idea that what they could have was better than what they did have. So, like, why do I have to deal with this man when I could get a divorce and get child support payments? Why would I, stick around with this woman that I no longer... Basically, they said, if you can convince a man to give up his responsibilities of providing for and raising children and all of that stuff, and you can convince a woman that she doesn't need a man for all that, you can all of a sudden divide the household. And once you can divide a household, then you can easily see, like, it's not even really dividing, you're incentivizing. You're
right,
incentivizing the separation of a family. And when you do that, then you're left with the results of divided, divorced, unsupported, whatever families. So if your dad leaves you, what do you think you're going to learn how to do? Leave your family. Like, how likely is it that you're going to be committed to your kids if your dad wasn't committed to you? And I mean, it's not like people are doing this stuff consciously, but if you've got an idea that, you don't need no man, you don't need no woman, and you're better off on your own, you're giving up your Judeo-Christian values of, whatever they were back then, and you're taking on some new age spirituality or something else, even atheism or agnosticism or something. All of these things can contribute to single parent households. And the likelihood that those children will be well looked after decreases an insane amount. And then you have a spike in out of wedlock births and a spike in abortions. And, it starts to spiral from there. It's as if those ideas were at the center, those incentives were at the center of whatever happened from the 60s until now. Because up until the 60s, black people were thriving. As much as, like, history can be examined factually, you can find some guys thinking, I was oppressed and I couldn't do X, Y, and Z, or my, brother was lynched or something. Like, those stories do exist, but the overwhelming facts that these people were laying out in this paints a very different picture. That up until the 60s, black people were thriving more and more and more. And then civil rights movement and LBJ's
Great
acts and
Society.
stuff, Great Society, completely flipped things up, and you just see a 180 of that momentum.
Right, so it's cutting them off at the knees. So it's interesting because as you were saying that, again, then became juxtaposed with now. So what was happening then? You had the youth, right? The youth from, let's say, 15 to probably 25, maybe even older. They weren't going to work anymore. They were going out into the streets. They were protesting. They were causing problems. In fact, my dad, in the early 60s, lived in South Central Los Angeles, and he was actually on the 110 freeway when the Watts riots broke out in the 60s. And that is what we're seeing today. What are the youth doing? Well, they're not going to fucking work. That's not what they're doing. No, they're tweeting and protesting and causing problems, but they're not. They've got this mentality of entitlement, which I'm guessing that's what they were sold on in the 60s. There was now this new sense of entitlement.
And not just entitlement, but moving away from developing useful skills, which makes them less useful and more dependent on handouts.
Right.
Like you combine those two things together, the entitlement. So you're going out there and spending your time demanding, certain things change and demanding certain handouts, and that has you spending less time developing your own, education, developing your own skill sets, which then has you less useful and less likely to get a job and less likely to take care of yourself. So now you're feeling more and more entitled and more victimized. So really, the entire switch, if I could pinpoint it in what they're summarizing in this movie, is that at some point in the 60s, African American culture shifted from focusing on creating value and being responsible to being victims and demanding handouts.
Right, being entitled. Yeah. So where does the filmmaker go with all this? Like, where does he, what are his conclusions? Like, does he kind of come to a point of like, here's where we need to go? Are there ideas of solutions or remedies? Like, where does the filmmaker take all this to?
Well, it's interesting. You would think that would be a good place to sum it up and end. But he continued it to really connect to, he went through abortions and talked about how 52% of black pregnancies end in abortions nowadays. He talked about how that's no longer a conversation about, one of the big things that I took away from this was that pre-19, say 30 or 40, towards the end of Booker T. Washington's work, he said that before that, say before 1920, the general conversation was not about racism or any other ism. It was about good versus evil. There's evil in the world and some people embody it and behaved this way. And there's good in the world and some people embodied it and behaved this way. But then came the onset of the ideas of racism. Well, if these people are evil, they're not really evil. They have an idea that their race is, supreme, that they're better than or something like that. And then that came on to other phobias like homophobia and all of these other things. So they really just started separating out different types of evil.
Yeah, that's neo-marxism. It's oppressor oppressed. That's what the conversation boils down to. That's where diversity, equity, and inclusion are born out of. So it's really, you see, that's when you have the infiltration by the Frankfurt School and the neo-Marxist ideals making their way into our culture and our educational institutions. That's when it began. It was, right around that time, the 20s and 30s. So it's, okay, perfect. Yeah, it makes perfect sense that at that point, and again, it's interesting that you brought up that it was a divergence from a conversation about good versus evil, which is based in Judeo-Christian principles, right? That's how we make determinations of good and evil. And then it goes into these neo-Marxist principles of oppressor versus oppressed.
And so they connected that from, it's no longer a conversation about, if abortion is good or evil. It's no longer about preserving an individual's life. It became a women's reproductive right at some point, which was really, I didn't know much about where Planned Parenthood started or how abortion really became a thing. They tied it back to a woman named Margaret Sanger.
She was a what do you call them?
Eugenics.
Yeah, eugenics, a eugenicist, right? Which again, you can really I'm gonna bring back the idea that there was no racism. There was definitely racism because eugenics actually has its roots back to the time of slavery, because when there was all this pushback from abolitionists that, hey, slavery's wrong. The argument was where eugenics was born from, because the argument was, no, they're less than human. So the people who were supporting slavery were trying to make the argument that, well, these African slaves, they're not really human, right? And which is, again, you're actually seeing this happen. Right. It's a dehumanization, right? You dehumanize, and then you can make it okay and acceptable for the enslavement of a people when you dehumanize them, which, again, we're seeing in our current culture. There is definitely a movement towards dehumanization happening. However, it's happening mostly towards men, white men in general, but or I'd say men in general, but specifically it's more targeted at white straight men. But there's a dehumanization of women happening, where now any man who just claims to be a woman is a woman. So you could put on womanhood as a costume, and how is that not dehumanizing towards actual women? You know,
where does that leave biological women?
Right. Yeah. I don't even like to use that word, because that's the only kind of woman there are. Is the biological kind. Kind of like when you mentioned biological babies. I'm like, not aware of any other kind, but okay, we'll go with biological babies or biological children.
Well, let me know what you think about the rest of this. I'll try to sum it up pretty quick here, because they started tying it into current events and current issues that people are dealing with, which is why they connected it to abortion, because that's a big thing that people are talking about. And they talked about how many black pregnancies are terminated, and they connected it to Margaret Sanger and eugenics and abortion, the belief that some people were degenerates and didn't deserve to live, and so it made it okay to abort those pregnancies. But then they went into talking about how they think that black people are being traded for a whole new victim class, aka illegal immigration. They said that not only is 60% of all births in the U.S. Latinos today, but Democrats are also advocating for wide open borders and ushering these people in by the millions and getting them basically completely reliant on government, even giving some of them without citizenship the right to vote. And they're like, what they're trying to do is what they did to the black people in the 60s, is bring in this whole class of people, make them dependent on government, and now you've got an entire class of victim voting citizens or non-citizens or whatever. What are they? A permanent class of victim voters is what they said. That's
right.
The entire
that makes sense.
Strategy that's going on right now. That's the big concern that they had towards the end.
Let me address that one before you go on to the next one. Yes, I think that's exactly what they believe they can achieve by opening up the borders and things. I think in the long run, I think that's going to backfire on them. And here's why I think that. Traditionally, and I'll say the culture of Mexico and I don't know much about many of the other South American countries, but I'm pretty familiar with Mexican culture. And these are a traditional people. These are people who embrace Judeo-Christian principles. These are hardworking people. But again, so were the blacks up until the 60s, right? So it's like, I could see how they could achieve that in the same way. But I also see that because of the nature of Hispanic culture, that because the immigrant class is new, you're not going to necessarily convince all the adults coming over the border, which is probably why they have this whole thing for the kids that come over, how they're, the dreamers and all this, because they know they can get their hooks in them, right? They know they can shape the way those kids think, because I guarantee you that was their foothold that they got in on the black communities, was the youth, right? We all in our youth experience this angst towards the establishment, right? An angst towards our parents, an angst towards the establishment, so you can capitalize on that, right? And so they're looking at basically capitalizing on the younger generation, and pulling it apart. I'm like, the more I talk about this, I'm realizing that this is exactly what they've already done, and that it might not actually be that difficult for them to do it again, because it's what they did with Black culture. So I was hoping, like, just because of my experience, and you know, I'm originally from Southern California, so I knew the Mexican culture. I was embedded in it. I was surrounded by it. So when I look at it, I'm like, no, I don't see them going for this because of their traditional beliefs, because of their hardworking nature. I would. It's hard for me to see them going for it. But again, they already did it, and they've already achieved it, so they know they could do it again.
Well, there's one big differentiating key factor versus, you know, the difference between Latin Americans and African Americans, and that's the organization called ICE. That's the deportation threat that they can pretty much hold over any non-American born citizen. So, you know, at least for 1 to 2 generations, they have that concern to watch out for. And even, like, I know people, you know, when I was in New Mexico, I knew people that were legal American citizens but were terrified of driving south of Albuquerque because they didn't want to get picked up and put in a detention center somewhere until all their paperwork got sorted out. And I'm like, dude, that is a very real threat that a lot of Latinos deal with in the US. And it's not like they were going to round up African Americans and send them back to Ghana. Like, they're not going to deport these people back to the African continent. So it's a little bit different, and at least until, you know, all these people realize that they are citizens and that they have certain rights. And then at that point, are they going to then, you know, stand up and be responsible, or are they going to demand, you know, handouts, reparations, and shit like that?
In reality, it's going to come down to the youth. It's going to come down to those Latin youth, whether or not they fall for the bullshit and start pushing for the entitlements, or believing themselves to be entitled and believing themselves to be victims, because I don't believe that their parents, especially if they're first generation, are going to fall for that or going to buy into that. So it's going to depend on how strong the youth are at seeing through the bullshit that's being presented to them.
Yeah, not to mention there are several Latino families, not several, there's a lot of them coming from countries that are already, you know, socialistic or communist. So they've got real life experiences of what that
they're
looks
terrified
like.
of it. Yeah, you're not going to convince the Venezuelans coming here that liberalism is a good idea. But you may, may convince a Brazilian or a Mexican, you might, but I doubt it, again, because you're not going to convince the adults of that, right? You can, now, if the kids are coming here young enough, right? So if a kid came here, you know, below the age of 10, they don't know any better. They don't remember necessarily their own culture, and they're going to be indoctrinated from day one to believe that they're victims, to believe that they're entitled, and so that is where it would spread from, is from this next generation, right? It wouldn't be from the people who are fleeing it, right? Like I said, you're not going to convince someone freshly out of Venezuela to vote for socialists. They're like, yeah, no, already did that, and it completely destroyed my country. But their children can be convinced of it, because their children will have no memory of what that was. Now, they may, because they'll hear the stories of it. So this is a distinguishing feature that the African communities didn't have, right? They didn't have an experience of the destructive nature of socialism. They didn't have that. But you're not going to convince a Cuban to vote liberal. You know what I mean? Like, in fact, what's his name? Pitbull, the Cuban artist. Like, I don't know what age he was when he came here, but he was probably pretty young. But he knows communism, and he knows he doesn't want it here, you know. And so you're probably like that. Even the first generation of kids from Venezuela are going to be like, it's going to be so close to them. They're going to hear the horror stories from their parents and grandparents that they're going to be like, yeah, we don't want that here. So it actually may work against them in the fact that socialism has reared its ugly head in the Latin cultures of Central and South America and North America, enough that they're wary of it and they're aware of the results of it. So that may, again, so my this may not work ideas back on the table. This may not be the greatest idea they ever came up with because of the exposure that Latin American countries have had to socialism and the negative impact it's had.
Well, if they're thinking generations out, then and they're playing the long game, then it's entirely feasible.
Right, the long game.
But there is one good barometer that they could use to to tell when the communities are ripe, and that would be the Latino communities in Florida. I was shocked to find out how many of them voted for Trump in the last time around, and it was like 80% of them or something. I'm like, how on earth could that be? And then that's when I learned a lot about like Venezuelans coming into Florida and living there and be like, oh, he sounds a lot like so and so. I'm not going to vote for that guy. I'm going to vote for this guy Trump because he's the opposite of that. And once you see those numbers switching, once you see those younger generations evening those numbers out, that's when you'll know that 1960 is about to come back around again, and it may take until 2060.
Right.
But that's
right.
Well,
that's the long game.
There's one more part of that they talked about towards the end of this movie, and that's that conservatives are really bad at marketing good ideas. But if they got good at that and they started communicating these ideas effectively to African American cultures and Latino American culture, and saying, hey, this is what we have to offer. This is when things have worked. Here's the true history of these different parties. If they were able to lay out things like this, they said that it's just kind of taken for granted that 90 to 95% of the black vote goes Democrat. But there is an enormous, like they said, it's low-hanging fruit. The African American culture is low-hanging fruit to the Republicans right now because of how many of those values actually are in line with African American culture.
Right, but I think a lot of it's been lost. And like when you look at the cultural issues now and where the black communities are at culturally, it's like they've lost connection to that. Like, and I mean, it's there, it's part of their history, but how many of them are still connected to their history? How many of them have been told stories by their grandparents? How many of them are connected to their grandparents? How many of them have learned any sense of values? I mean, when you're talking about the black community killing the black community, like clearly there's something missing there. There's something in the gap. There is a disconnect from their original morality and principles. That's just, it's not there right now. Now reconnecting them with that and having them see, and I think you kind of spoke into this, like the lack of awareness of what their history in this country has been. Like the fact that you can point back to the Jim Crow South in the 50s and it's better than what you have now. Like that's not something that's like,
well, why?
That's going to occur to people, but it's because there's a complete lack of awareness of what the black family was in the Jim Crow South in the 50s and what black culture and community was in the Jim Crow South in the 50s. Like there's a disconnect, right? So they're really not aware. Their presumption and assumption is what they're experiencing now is actually better than what was then. And it's not, but they're being told it is. They're being told what they have right now, which is, massive amounts of crime, dilapidated cities. I don't know what the percentages of business ownership or property ownership or anything are now, but I guarantee it's probably a lot less than it was in the early 60s, late
Mhm.
50s, and that's something they're not even aware of. Like their conception of what they have now is that whatever was in the 50s was probably worse, and that's just not the case.
And it's interesting to think about the familial structure, because a lot of these people started talking about how good of a relationship they had with their dad, which is why they have certain values and they understand certain things about history. I'm like, if you don't have a good relationship with your dad or your mom, how connected do you think you're going to be with your grandparents on either side? You're probably not going to be connected
Right.
with them hardly at all, which means you're not getting like secondhand facts from the 50s or earlier. So the only thing that you know about that time period, like before the civil rights movement, is school, is
What's being
movies.
fed to you through the distorted educational system and the distorted media.
Yep. All the entertainment stuff that you hear. And so when you see Jay-Z up there talking about, we got to have some serious conversations about, the N-word and reparations, and people go, oh man, yeah, of course. And then you got guys like Colin Kaepernick. Is that his name?
Kaepernick.
Yeah. And he's half white, half black. But yet he's totally moved over and identified with the black half of him and not the white half of him. Like, those are things that these guys are talking about. And they even went into talking about Obama and how he ran his entire campaign on basically merit-based campaign, where he was like, if I don't get chosen, I know it's not because I'm black. I know that it's because I didn't show the American people a future that they could believe in and support that I could deliver. And then as soon as he gets
Right.
inaugurated, he starts coming out and talking about how racism is in the DNA of this country and that there's no getting rid of it, and exaggerated the situation.
And how oppressed he is in
Yeah.
his wife.
And has been throughout his life. I mean, it's just like
Right.
all of
You're
a
like,
sudden
wait
the
a
light
minute,
switched.
You're in the upper echelon of our society. You've been elected president of the most powerful nation on earth, and you're oppressed? How does that work?
I mean, the way that they, like, if I could summarize the end of that film when they were talking about this, and then I'll go into their closing concept. But
Okay.
just at the end of there, it's as if racism since the civil rights movement had died and gotten less and less and less, to where in my young adulthood, I don't remember any real racism. Like, some things like, oh yeah, black guys got big dicks and Asians are really smart, and like no real racism, but like stereotype type of stuff, which was
Stereotypes,
more
right.
funny than detrimental to who I was trying to be in the world. And so once Obama came, then it was like, okay, racism is officially over. And everybody that they interviewed was like, oh, my heart just was able to relax. And then he came out and exacerbated things and basically reinvigorated racism in the country. And I was like, oh, so it's like it died on the cross and was reborn. It's like
Yeah.
the rebirth
there you
of
go.
racism in the country happened over his 8 years or whatever you want to call it. And then you throw Trump on the end of it, and he shows up in his campaign, which they showed and talked about. They're like, he was our first like cultural leader of the black community. And they showed him going in there and like looking people dead in the eye over his campaign, and looking in the camera and being like, your inner cities are crumbling and your businesses are suffering and your families are coming apart. He's like, what do you got to lose? That was his marketing to the black community. And everybody was so offended and so pissed off that he would say that. But people like, Candace Owens and some of these other people that they had in there interviewing, they were all like, oh man, it hurt, but he was right. Like, what do I got to lose? Let's try Trump. And so then all of a sudden they all moved over to like being a Republican and understanding the history of the Republican Party and blah 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 blah. It was actually quite funny, but also interesting to look at Barack Obama's presidency in that way, because I had never really considered the race aspect of his presidency because it honestly didn't fucking matter to me. But looking back on it, like that was my experience. Oh man, racism is over. And then he started talking about it again. He's like, wait a minute, what? You're talking about race more than any other candidate or any other person I've ever heard before. And then here we are, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the closing idea that I actually genuinely appreciate from this film is, I just wrote this little quote here. He said, "Black people are bigger than any program, and they can achieve so much more than anything a government or governmental program can offer." He's like, we as a community can do so much better when we come to that realization. So again, he tied the entire film back to the realization that if you choose to be responsible, you can create anything. And history has proved that. As soon as you adopt the victim mentality and start asking for handouts, everything crumbles underneath you. And that, like, you could sum up the entire movie with that sentence, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and again, I think you can't separate that from the neo-Marxism that's made its way into our culture and is, at the forefront of liberalism today. Like, that is the central tenets of Marxism, and why it's just you can't give me a single example of Marxism or any form of communism not completely destroying a culture and a society and costing the lives of millions, or in the case of China and Soviet Union, 100 million, dead because of bad ideas, and
Bad
that's
ideas.
really where we're heading. It's just bad ideas. And now you know why they push so hard against merit. Because their ideas are so bad, they don't want anyone actually looking at them and gauging the merit of their ideas, because they're terrible ideas. They're fucking terrible ideas.
Well, also, merit would be the antithesis of their bad ideas. Like, if you adopt their ideas and you're like, well, it's a merit-based system too, I need to stand on my own merit and believe, they're incompatible. You cannot have those ideas and be fully competent yourself. I mean, you can, but they both don't survive. You end up getting hired because of your merit, and then you can't hold that belief anymore. Like, oh, I guess it's because I'm talented. Or you get the diversity hire, and you're like, well, I guess I didn't need my merit. But they don't. They both don't take you to the same destination. I'll put it that way.
Indeed. Well, I think we've beat this horse.
I think so. There's nothing else about this that I would say except for there is a Uncle Tom 2, and that one goes into much more depth, I think, around the civil rights movement and the role models that are put up in front of us nowadays, and how all of that is leading down the same path and basically recreating history. Just like how you had some of these black leaders, like, for instance, I don't think they really talked about this in the second movie, but it's what I saw and what I understood early on with Malcolm X, where as soon as he was jumping out there saying that white people were devils and you needed to have segregation and leave us alone and send us back to Africa, like, he was promoted, he was famous, he was well off. And as soon as he, went out of the country and came back, he was like, man, I prayed with some white people, and it's not white people that are the problem, it's racism. Bam, they killed that man dead. And it's like, that they go into that type of stuff where they really viciously, violently defend it.
It's interesting. He also, interestingly enough, came out against liberalism and how the liberal establishment was the biggest problem for the black communities of the United States. All right. Well, I look forward to talking about that next time. Thank you very much for this. I feel like I got a lot out of this conversation, and I will talk to you soon, my friend.
Absolutely. Talk to you next time.